Okinawa, May 28, 1945. Sergeant James Takahashi steps from the jeep into hell. Through the crowd of screaming villagers he sees her, a young woman tied to a post, bleeding, a wooden sign hanging from her neck. The word is unmistakable: traitor. In 60 seconds she'll be dead. What happens next will define everything he believes about honor, loyalty, and what it means to be human in the midst of war. The dust settles around Jim's boots as he surveys the scene. Mabuni village is a graveyard of shattered homes and burned-out buildings, another casualty in the brutal final weeks of the Battle of Okinawa. The smell hits him first. Smoke, death, and something else. Fear. It hangs in the oppressive heat like a physical presence thick enough to choke on. The crowd numbers may be 30 or 40 people, mostly elderly men, women, and a few children. Their faces are gaunt, hollowed by starvation and trauma, but their eyes burn with something dangerous. Desperation mixed with the kind of rage that comes from having nothing left to lose. They're shouting in Japanese, voices overlapping into a cacophony of accusation and hatred, all directed at the figure tied to the bamboo post in the center of the village square. Jim's hand instinctively moves to his M1 Garand, then stops. Drawing a weapon now would be the worst possible move. Behind him, Lieutenant Morrison and 3 riflemen from their patrol wait by the jeep, fingers near triggers, eyes scanning for threats. Morrison is already shifting his weight, ready to order a retreat. Jim knows what his commanding officer is thinking. This is a local matter not worth American lives. Let the natives sort it out themselves. But Jim can't look away from the woman at the post. She's young, maybe 19 or 20, wearing what was once a white uniform now stained brown with dried blood and dirt. Her head hangs forward, black hair obscuring her face, but he can see the cuts on her arms, the bruises darkening her exposed skin. The rope binding her wrists to the bamboo has cut deep enough to draw blood, and that sign, that damned wooden placard hanging from her neck like a millstone, traitor, written in bold Japanese characters. Jim has seen this before. Twice in Shuri, once in Naha. The Kempei's signature terror tactic, a way to maintain control even as the Japanese military front collapses. Mark someone as a collaborator, let the civilians do the dirty work, and the message spreads like wildfire. Cooperation with the Americans means death. It doesn't matter if the accusation is true. It doesn't even matter if the Kempei are still in the area. The fear they've cultivated does the work for them. A stone arcs through the air and strikes the woman's shoulder. She flinches but doesn't cry out. Either she's too weak or too resigned to her fate. Another stone follows, then another. The crowd is working itself into a frenzy, feeding off its own momentum. Jim knows how this ends. He's arrived at villages where the posts still stood, but the accused were already dead, beaten or stoned, left as warnings to anyone else who might consider surrender. He has maybe 60 seconds before this becomes a murder, 30 seconds before it becomes irreversible. "Lieutenant," Jim says, not taking his eyes off the crowd. His voice is steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding his system. "Permission to intervene." Morrison's response is exactly what Jim expected. "Negative, Sergeant. This is a local dispute. We're not here to referee civilian justice." "Sir, that's not justice. That's a lynching. That's not our call to make, Takahashi." Morrison's tone carries a warning. "We've got orders to secure the area and move on. 5 more villages to check before nightfall. We don't have time for this." Jim finally turns to face his commanding officer. Morrison is a decent man, as officers go, doesn't use racial slurs, treats Jim with professional respect, even defended him once when a replacement soldier made a crack about Japs in American uniforms. But Morrison is also tired, stretched thin by 3 months of brutal combat, and operating under the same calculus that governs every military decision. Minimize American casualties, complete the mission, go home alive. "Sir, if we let this happen, we're complicit, and we lose any chance of getting cooperation from civilians in the next village, or the one after that. They need to see that we're different from the Kempei, that we don't tolerate this kind of brutality." Morrison's jaw tightens. He glances at the crowd, at the woman, then back at Jim. The calculation is visible in his eyes. Risk versus reward, mission parameters versus moral obligation. Finally, he exhales sharply through his nose. 5 minutes, Sergeant. You get 5 minutes to sort this out. If it goes sideways, we extract immediately. And if you start a firefight, I'm writing you up for disobeying orders. Clear? Crystal clear, sir. Jim doesn't wait for Morrison to change his mind. He steps forward away from the relative safety of the Jeep and the covering fire of 3 M1 carbines. His own rifle remains slung across his back, a calculated risk. Approaching with weapon in hand would confirm every piece of propaganda the Japanese military has fed these people about American brutality. He needs to be something else right now. Not an American soldier, not even really a Japanese American. He needs to be a figure of authority that these villagers will recognize and, more importantly, obey. The crowd notices him immediately. The shouting falters, replaced by confused murmuring. Jim hears the whispers. American, soldier, but also Japanese face. One of us, traitor like her. He's used to this cognitive dissonance the way people on both sides of this war struggle to categorize him. To the Americans, he's a Jap in a U.S. uniform, useful but never quite trusted. To the Japanese, he's a race traitor, a betrayer of his blood. He exists in a liminal space belonging fully to neither side. Right now, he's going to use that ambiguity as a weapon. Jim stops 10 feet from the crowd and draws himself to full attention. Then he speaks, and the words that come out are not the casual Japanese he uses for interrogations or the gentle, persuasive dialect he employs when coaxing civilians out of caves. This is Keigo, the formal, hierarchical Japanese of authority figures, the language of officers, bureaucrats, and the Kempeitai themselves. Stop, in the name of the empire. The effect is immediate and electric. The crowd freezes. Stones that were in motion drop to the ground. Every face turns toward him, eyes wide with shock and confusion. Jim can see the gears turning in their heads. The uniform says American, but the face says Japanese, and the voice says authority. The cognitive dissonance creates a moment of paralysis, and Jim seizes it. He strides forward with the confidence of a man who expects to be obeyed, his posture rigid, his expression stern. He's channeling every Kempeitai officer he's ever observed, every Japanese commander he's interrogated. The performance has to be perfect because his life, and the woman's life, depends on it. Who authorized this execution? Jim's voice cracks like a whip, formal and demanding. He scans the crowd looking for the ringleader. There's always a ringleader, someone who initiated the accusation, who whipped the others into action. Jim finds him quickly, an older man, maybe 60, standing slightly apart from the others. His clothes are less ragged than the rest, and there's something in his posture, a rigidity that speaks of military training or police work. Jim points directly at him. You, step forward. The man hesitates, and in that hesitation, Jim sees confirmation. This is the Kempeitai informant, or at least someone who fancies himself an authority figure. The man's eyes dart to the woman, to the crowd, then back to Jim. Finally, he steps forward, trying to match Jim's authoritative bearing but falling short. She is a traitor, the man says, his voice carrying the rehearsed certainty of propaganda. She surrendered to the enemy. She betrayed the emperor and brought shame upon her family and village. The punishment is just. Jim takes another step closer, invading the man's personal space. And who are you to pass judgment? Are you Kempeitai? Show me your identification. Show me your orders. The man's face flushes. I am a loyal subject of the emperor. I need no orders to recognize treason when I see it. So you admit you have no authority? Jim's voice drops, becoming even more dangerous. You have taken it upon yourself to execute a Japanese citizen without trial, without investigation, without due process. In doing so, you violate the very laws you claim to uphold. The crowd is watching now, the momentum of violence disrupted by this unexpected challenge to their assumed moral authority. Jim can feel the shift, the uncertainty creeping in. He presses his advantage. Tell me, Jim says, his voice carrying across the square. What evidence do you have of this woman's treason? Did you see her provide intelligence to the enemy? Did she guide American troops? Did she commit sabotage against Japanese forces? She surrendered, the man shouts, desperation creeping into his voice. She walked out of the cave hospital with her hands raised. She chose life over honor. She chose to live, Jim says flatly. And for that, you would kill her. Tell me, where is the honor in attacking a defenseless woman? Where is the courage in binding someone to a post and throwing stones? Is this the Bushido you claim to follow? Is this the way of the samurai? The word Bushido lands like a physical blow. Jim sees several people in the crowd flinch, sees shame flicker across faces. He's touching something deep in the cultural consciousness, the gap between the idealized warrior code they've been taught to revere and the brutal reality of what they're doing. The samurai code demands courage against equals, Jim continues, his voice ringing with conviction. It demands honor in combat, mercy to the defeated, and justice tempered with compassion. What you are doing here is not Bushido, it is cowardice, it is cruelty, and it shames your ancestors. The ringleader's face has gone from red to pale. He's losing control of the narrative, and he knows it. He makes one last desperate attempt to regain authority. The Americans will kill us all. They will torture and rape and murder. She has brought them down upon us. Jim lets the words hang in the air for a moment. Then he speaks, and his next words are in English, clear and deliberate. Lieutenant Morrison, please step forward. Behind him, Jim hears Morrison's boots on the packed earth. The lieutenant moves to stand beside Jim, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol, but his posture non-threatening. Jim switches back to Japanese. This is Lieutenant Morrison of the United States Army. He commands this patrol. Tell me, have any of you been harmed by American soldiers today? Has anyone been killed? Tortured? Raped? Silence. The crowd shifts uncomfortably, but no one speaks. I am Sergeant James Takahashi, also of the United States Army. I was born in Los Angeles, California. My parents came from Hiroshima. I am Japanese by blood and American by birth. I am what you would call a traitor to my race. Jim lets that sink in, sees the confusion deepen. And yet I stand before you, asking you to see the truth. We are not demons, we are not monsters, we are soldiers doing our duty, yes, but we are also human beings who value life and justice. Jim turns his back on the ringleader, a calculated insult, and addresses the crowd directly. You have been told lies. You have been told that surrender means death, that Americans are savages, that the only honorable path is to die fighting or to take your own lives. But look around you. How many of you have seen American soldiers shoot civilians who did not resist? How many of you have been harmed by us? More silence. Then from the back of the crowd, an elderly woman's voice, thin and wavering. My grandson surrendered 3 days ago. The Americans gave him food and water. They treated his wounds. He is alive. The ringleader whirls on her. Silence. You spread defeatist lies. I speak the truth, the woman says, her voice growing stronger. And I am tired of death. I am tired of watching children die for honor that fills no bellies and mends no wounds. Jim sees the moment the crowd's cohesion breaks. It's subtle, a shifting of weight, a lowering of eyes, a collective exhale. The spell of violence is broken, replaced by exhaustion and doubt. The ringleader sees it too, and his face contorts with rage and fear. He's lost control, and in losing control, he's exposed himself as a fraud. Jim doesn't give him time to recover. He walks past the man, dismissing him as irrelevant, and approaches the woman tied to the post. Up close, her injuries are worse than he thought. Her face is swollen, one eye nearly shut. Blood has dried in her hair. Her breathing is shallow and rapid. Shock, dehydration, possibly internal injuries. But she's alive, and Jim intends to keep her that way. He pulls his combat knife from its sheath, and the crowd gasps. Jim ignores them, focusing on the ropes binding the woman's wrists. The hemp has been tied with vicious tightness, cutting deep into her skin. He slides the blade carefully between rope and flesh and begins to saw. The knife is sharp, and the rope parts quickly. As her hands come free, the woman's legs buckle. Jim catches her before she falls, supporting her weight. She's lighter than she should be. Starvation has hollowed her out. He can feel her trembling, feel the rapid flutter of her heartbeat. She's barely conscious, her head lolling against his shoulder. Jim removes his poncho and wraps it around her, covering the blood-stained uniform and the worst of her injuries. It's partly for her dignity, partly to prevent any of Morrison's men from mistaking her for a combatant. He lifts her carefully, one arm under her knees, the other supporting her back. She weighs almost nothing. Behind him, the ringleader makes one final attempt. You are a traitor to your race. You betray your ancestors and your blood. Jim turns, the woman cradled in his arms, and looks the man in the eye. I am loyal to humanity, he says quietly. You should try it. He walks back toward the jeep, Morrison falling into step beside him, the three riflemen providing cover. The crowd doesn't move. Some watch with hostility, but others, like the elderly woman who spoke up, bow slightly as he passes. It's a small gesture, barely perceptible, but Jim sees it. Recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, or simply relief that the violence has ended. Morrison helps Jim settle the woman in the back of the Jeep. She's drifting in and out of consciousness, her lips moving soundlessly. Jim climbs in beside her, cradling her head to keep it from bouncing on the rough road. Morrison takes the passenger seat and the driver guns the engine. As they pull away from Mabuni village, Jim looks back. The crowd has dispersed, melting back into the ruins of their homes. The bamboo post stands empty, the rope lying in the dust. And there, trampled into the dirt, is the wooden sign. Traitor. Jim wonders who the real traitors are. The woman who chose life, or the people who would have killed her for it. The drive to the CIC post in Idomen takes 20 minutes over roads cratered by artillery and clogged with refugees. The woman, Jim still doesn't know her name, regains consciousness briefly, her eyes fluttering open. She looks up at him, confusion and fear warring in her expression. Then she sees his face, sees the Japanese features, and the fear intensifies. "It's okay," Jim says softly in Japanese. "You're safe." She doesn't believe him. Why would she? But she's too weak to resist, and eventually her eyes close again. Morrison doesn't speak during the drive, but Jim can feel the lieutenant's disapproval radiating like heat. They've lost time, deviated from the patrol route, and taken on a detainee who will require processing and medical attention. By Morrison's calculus, Jim has made their day harder for the sake of one Japanese civilian. Jim doesn't argue. He knows Morrison isn't wrong exactly. He's just operating under a different set of priorities. The CIC post is a commandeered school building, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes and its windows blown out. A Navy corpsman meets them at the entrance, takes one look at the woman, and immediately calls for a stretcher. They carry her inside to what was once a classroom, now converted into a makeshift medical station. The corpsman is efficient and professional. He cuts away the remains of her uniform, cataloging injuries as he works. Multiple contusions, lacerations on the arms and torso, possible fractured ribs, severe dehydration, signs of shock. She's been through hell, but she'll live. He starts an IV, administers sulfa drugs to prevent infection, and begins cleaning and bandaging the wounds. Jim watches from the doorway, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that carried him through the confrontation is draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness. He's been in Okinawa for 8 weeks, and every day has been like this. Violence and trauma, death and desperation, punctuated by brief moments of humanity that feel increasingly fragile. Sergeant Takahashi, Captain Weber, the CIC officer in charge, appears at his elbow. Weber is a career intelligence man, sharp-eyed and perpetually skeptical. "Lieutenant Morrison briefed me. You pulled this girl out of a village mob?" "Yes, sir. They had her marked as a traitor. Would have killed her if we hadn't intervened." Weber nods, unsurprised. "We've seen a dozen cases like this in the past week. Kempeitai informants trying to maintain control through terror. Sometimes it's legitimate collaboration, but usually it's just scapegoating. Someone needs to be punished and the weakest person becomes the target." He glances at the woman on the stretcher. "What's her story?" "Don't know yet, sir. She was barely conscious when we found her." "Well, let's find out." Weber gestures for Jim to follow him into the classroom. The corpsman has finished his initial treatment and stepped back. The woman is awake now, her eyes tracking their movements with wary alertness. Weber pulls up a chair and sits, deliberately positioning himself at her eye level rather than looming over her. It's a small gesture, but Jim appreciates it. Weber might be a hardened intelligence officer, but he understands the psychology of interrogation. Fear produces lies, while respect produces truth. "Sergeant, please interpret," Weber says. Then, to the woman, "What is your name?" Jim translates, and after a long moment the woman responds. Her voice is hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Nakamura Yuki." "How old are you, Miss Nakamura?" 19. "What was your role in the Japanese military?" Yuki's eyes flicker with something, shame perhaps, or fear of judgment. "I was not military. I was a student. But in March, my school was mobilized. We became the Himiyuri Student Nurse Corps." Jim feels something cold settle in his stomach. He's heard of the Himiyuri Corps, 240 female students, most of them teenagers, pressed into service as nurses for the Japanese military. The reports that have filtered through intelligence channels are grim. Most of the girls are dead, killed in the fighting or ordered to commit suicide by their officers. Weber's expression doesn't change, but Jim sees his hand tighten on his notepad. Tell me what happened. Yuki's story comes out in fragments, her voice breaking occasionally. Jim translates, keeping his tone neutral even as the details make his chest tighten. She describes the cave hospital near Itaman, the darkness and the stench, the soldiers dying in agony without morphine or anesthesia. She describes the Kempe Tai officer who watched them constantly, who accused anyone showing weakness of defeatism, who promised that the Americans would torture and rape any prisoners. She describes the final day, when American forces surrounded the cave. The Kempe Tai officer's order: detonate grenades, kill the patients, commit suicide. The other nurses complying. The explosions, the screams, and her own decision, made in a moment of clarity or cowardice. She still doesn't know which, to walk out with her hands raised. I could not do it, she whispers. I looked at the soldiers, boys younger than me, and I could not kill them. I could not kill myself, so I walked out. I thought the Americans would shoot me. I thought it would be quick. But they didn't shoot you, Weber says gently. No, they gave me water. They were confused. I think they did not expect a girl. They asked questions I could not answer. I speak no English. Then they let me go. They told me to return to my village. Her voice drops even lower. I should have known better. I should have known what would happen. The villagers accused you of collaboration, Jim says. It's not a question. Yuki nods. A man, I think he was Kempe Tai, or worked for them, he saw me return. He told everyone I had betrayed the emperor, that I had brought shame on the village. They tied me to the post. They said I would be an example. She looks up at Jim, her eyes haunted. I think they would have killed me. I think I wanted them to. It would have been easier than living with the shame. Jim translates for Weber, then adds his own observation. Sir, this is a non-combatant civilian. She was conscripted, not enlisted. She followed orders until those orders became unconscionable. She surrendered rather than commit murder or suicide. By any reasonable standard, she's a victim, not a collaborator. Weber nods slowly. Agreed. Standard protocol. We'll process her as a civilian detainee. No intelligence value, no security threat. She'll be transferred to the military government civilian camp at Ishikawa. He looks at Yuki, his expression softening slightly. Miss Nakamura, you are not a prisoner. You are under the protection of the United States military. You will be taken to a camp where you will receive food, medical care, and shelter. When the war ends, you will be free to return home or go wherever you choose. Do you understand? Jim translates, and Yuki's eyes fill with tears. She nods, unable to speak. Weber stands, closing his notepad. Sergeant, make sure she's on the next transport to Ishikawa, and add a note to her file. Subject at risk of reprisal violence. Recommend protective custody. I don't want her sent back to that village. Yes, sir. Weber leaves and Jim is alone with Yuki. The corpsman has moved on to other patients and the classroom is quiet except for the distant rumble of artillery. Jim pulls up the chair Weber vacated and sits. Why did you save me? Yuki asks suddenly. Her Japanese is formal, almost archaic. The speech of an educated girl from a good family. You are American. I am your enemy. Jim considers the question. It's one he's asked himself 100 times, in 100 different contexts. Why does he do this? Why does he risk his life to save people who would call him a traitor, who would kill him if the circumstances were reversed? Why does he serve a country that imprisoned his family, that views him with suspicion and contempt? You're not my enemy, he says finally. You're a 19-year-old girl who was forced into an impossible situation and made the choice to live. That doesn't make you a traitor. It makes you human. But your country? My country is complicated, Jim says. I was born in America, but my parents came from Japan. When the war started, my government decided that my face made me a threat. They took my family from our home and put us in a camp in the desert. Barbed wire, guard towers, the whole thing. We lost everything, our house, our business, our dignity. Yuki's eyes widen. Then why do you fight for them? It's the question Jim's father asked when he announced his decision to enlist. It's the question his mother wept over. It's the question he asks himself every time an American soldier calls him Jap or a Japanese prisoner spits at his feet. Because I believe in what America is supposed to be, Jim says slowly. Not what it is right now, but what it could be. A place where it doesn't matter where your parents came from or what you look like. A place where justice and freedom aren't just words, but realities. My country has failed to live up to those ideals, especially with people like me. But I still believe the ideals are worth fighting for. He pauses, then adds, and because I can do things here that matter, I can save lives. I can be a bridge between two sides that see each other as monsters. I can prove that loyalty isn't about blood or race. It's about choices. Every time I convince someone to surrender instead of dying, every time I stop an execution like yours, I'm proving that humanity is stronger than hatred. Yuki is silent for a long moment. Then she says, in Japan, we are taught that surrender is the ultimate shame, that death is preferable to dishonor. But you say that choosing life is not shameful. Choosing life is the bravest thing you can do, Jim says. Dying is easy. Living with your choices, facing the consequences, building something new from the ruins, that takes real courage. I do not feel brave. I feel like a coward. You walked out of that cave knowing you might be shot. You survived a mob that wanted to kill you. You're still here, still fighting to live. That's not cowardice, Miss Nakamura. That's strength. Tears spill down Yuki's cheeks, and she doesn't wipe them away. The other girls, the ones who stayed in the cave, they are dead now. They followed orders, they died with honor. And I ran away. You survived. Jim corrects gently. And survival means you have the chance to do something with your life, to honor the memory of the girls who died by living well, by building peace instead of perpetuating war. That's not betrayal. That's the most meaningful thing you can do. Yuki closes her eyes, and Jim sees the exhaustion overtake her. The corpsman returns, checks her vitals, and nods approvingly. She needs rest more than anything. The transport to Ishikawa leaves at 600 tomorrow. She'll be ready. Jim stands to leave, but Yuki's voice stops him. Sergeant Takahashi, thank you for my life. I will not waste it. Jim looks back at her. This girl who chose life over honor, who survived when survival itself was an act of rebellion. I know you won't, he says. He walks out of the classroom into the fading light of late afternoon. Morrison is waiting by the jeep, smoking a cigarette. He offers one to Jim, who takes it gratefully. They smoke in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, painting the ruined landscape in shades of gold and red. You did good back there, Morrison says finally. In the village, I mean. I wasn't sure it was the right call, but you did good. Thank you, sir. How many does that make? Civilians you've pulled out of bad situations? Jim thinks about it. The family in the cave near Shuri, convinced that the Americans would eat their children. The old man in Naha who was about to detonate a grenade in a crowd of refugees. The teenage boy who was going to charge a machine gun nest with a bamboo spear. I don't know. I stopped counting. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're making a difference. I know it doesn't always feel like it, but you are. Jim nods, not trusting himself to speak. The exhaustion is catching up with him, the weight of 8 weeks of war pressing down on his shoulders. He thinks about Yuki, about the Himeyuri nurses who died in the cave, about the villagers who were ready to commit murder out of fear and propaganda. He thinks about his family in Manzanar, about the country that imprisoned them and the uniform he wears despite that injustice. War makes everyone into something they're not, he'd told Yuki. The question is, what we choose to be when we have the choice. Jim finishes his cigarette and grinds it out under his boot. Tomorrow, there will be more villages, more caves, more desperate people caught between two armies and two ideologies. Tomorrow, there will be more chances to build bridges or burn them, to save lives or look away. Tomorrow, the war will continue, grinding forward toward its inevitable conclusion. But today, one girl is alive who would have been dead. Today, Jim made the choice to see a human being instead of an enemy. Today, he proved, to himself if no one else, that loyalty to humanity is the highest loyalty of all. It's not much. In the vast machinery of war, one life saved is a drop in an ocean of blood. But it's something. And right now, something is enough. The story of Sergeant James Takahashi and Yuki Nakamura is one small thread in the vast tapestry of the Battle of Okinawa, but it represents thousands of similar moments that played out across the Pacific in the final months of World War II. The Military Intelligence Service, composed of 6,000 Japanese-American soldiers, operated in the shadows of the war, their contributions classified and unrecognized for decades. These men, many of whom had families imprisoned in internment camps, served with distinction and courage, translating captured documents, interrogating prisoners, and most importantly, saving civilian lives through their unique ability to bridge two cultures at war. The statistics tell part of the story. MIS linguists translated over 18,000 enemy documents, providing crucial intelligence that shortened the war and saved American lives. They interrogated more than 10,000 prisoners of war, extracting information that prevented ambushes and revealed enemy positions. But perhaps their most significant contribution was in the realm of psychological warfare and civilian protection. In Okinawa alone, MIS interpreters convinced more than 7,000 civilians to emerge from caves and surrender, preventing mass suicides and civilian casualties. The Himyuri Student Nurse Corps represents another tragic chapter of the Okinawa campaign. Of the 240 young women mobilized in March 1945, 136 were killed, a mortality rate of 57%. They died in bombing raids from starvation and disease, and in many cases from following orders to commit suicide rather than surrender. The survivors carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives, many struggling with guilt over their survival when so many of their classmates died. The broader civilian catastrophe of Okinawa is almost incomprehensible in its scale. Between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawan civilians died during the 3-month battle, roughly 1/3 of the island's entire population. They died in the crossfire between two massive armies, from starvation and disease in the caves where they sheltered, and in horrifying numbers from forced mass suicides ordered by Japanese military authorities who convinced them that American capture meant torture and death. The compulsory group suicides, known in Japanese as shudan jiketsu, remain one of the most controversial and painful aspects of the battle. Japanese military officers distributed grenades to civilian families and ordered them to kill themselves rather than surrender. Entire families died together in caves, parents killing their children before taking their own lives. Survivors' testimonies described the psychological pressure, the propaganda that painted Americans as demons, and the presence of Kempeitai enforcers who shot anyone who refused to comply. Against this backdrop of horror, the work of MIS interpreters like Jim Takahashi takes on profound significance. Using loudspeakers, leaflets, and personal appeals, they worked tirelessly to counter the propaganda and convince civilians that surrender meant safety, not death. They risked their lives entering caves to negotiate with terrified families, often facing hostile fire from Japanese soldiers determined to prevent surrenders. They served as living proof that Japanese and Americans could coexist, that the enemy was not a faceless demon, but a human being capable of mercy and justice. The irony of their service is impossible to ignore. These men fought for a country that had imprisoned their families, that viewed them with suspicion and prejudice, that denied them basic civil rights, even as it demanded their loyalty. The internment of Japanese Americans remains one of the darkest chapters in American history, a wholesale violation of constitutional rights driven by racism and wartime hysteria. Over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, were forcibly removed from their homes and imprisoned in remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The loyalty questionnaire administered to internees in 1943 included two infamous questions. Question 27 asked if they were willing to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. Question 28 asked if they would swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear allegiance to the Japanese Emperor. For many internees, these questions were impossible to answer without betraying either their principles or their safety. Those who answered no to both questions, the so-called no-no boys, were segregated and faced even harsher treatment. Yet thousands of young Japanese American men answered yes and volunteered for military service. Some joined the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in Europe and became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. Others, like Jim Takahashi, were recruited for the Military Intelligence Service, where their language skills and cultural knowledge made them invaluable. The training for MIS linguists was rigorous and intensive. At Camp Savage in Minnesota, and later at Fort Snelling, recruits spent months mastering military Japanese. learning to read captured documents, practicing interrogation techniques, and studying Japanese culture and psychology. The instructors emphasized that their role was not just translation but interpretation, understanding context, reading between the lines, and serving as cultural bridges. In the field, MIS linguists operated under extraordinary pressure. They accompanied frontline units, often coming under fire while attempting to negotiate surrenders. They faced hostility from both sides, American soldiers who viewed them with suspicion, and Japanese soldiers and civilians who saw them as traitors. The casualty rate for MIS personnel was 25%, the highest of any intelligence unit in the war. Despite their contributions, MIS veterans received little recognition for decades. Their work was classified as top secret, and they were forbidden from discussing their service even with family members. It wasn't until 1972 that the classification was lifted, and not until the 1990s that their contributions began to receive wider public acknowledgement. In 2010, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded collectively to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the MIS, finally recognizing their service and sacrifice. The post-war experiences of MIS veterans varied widely. Some, like the fictional Jim Takahashi, used the GI Bill to pursue education and build successful careers. Many became advocates for Japanese-American civil rights, joining organizations like the Japanese American Citizens League to fight for redress and recognition. In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act formally apologized for the internment and provided reparations to surviving internees, a partial acknowledgement of the injustice they had suffered. For Himyuri survivors like Yuki Nakamura, the post-war years were equally challenging. Many faced social stigma in Japan, where survival was sometimes viewed as shameful compared to those who had died honorably. The psychological trauma of their experiences, the violence they witnessed, the deaths of their classmates, the impossible choices they were forced to make, haunted them for decades. Some emigrated, seeking fresh starts in places like Brazil, Peru, or the United States. Others remained in Okinawa, eventually finding the courage to share their testimonies for the sake of peace education. The Himeyuri Peace Museum, established in 1989, preserves the memory of the student nurses and serves as a powerful reminder of war's human cost. Survivors who once struggled to speak about their experiences became advocates for peace, sharing their stories with younger generations. Their message is consistent. War destroys not just bodies but souls, and the pursuit of peace is the only way to honor those who died. Okinawa itself bears deep scars from the battle. The island hosts a disproportionate share of U.S. military bases in Japan, a legacy of the war that continues to generate controversy and protest. The Okinawan peace movement is among the strongest in Japan, rooted in the island's unique history of suffering. The Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum and the Peace Memorial Park serve as sites of remembrance and education, documenting the civilian experience of the battle and advocating for a world without war. The story of Jim Takahashi and Yuki Nakamura, though dramatized, reflects documented realities of the Okinawa campaign. MIS interpreters did intervene to stop lynchings and executions of accused collaborators. They did use their cultural knowledge and language skills to diffuse violent situations. They did save individual lives at great personal risk, operating in the moral and cultural space between two warring nations. The broader lesson of their story transcends the specific historical moment. It speaks to the power of individual moral courage in the face of systemic injustice and violence. Jim Takahashi serves a country that has wronged him, not out of blind loyalty but from a belief in ideals that transcend current failures. Yuki Nakamura chooses life over honor culture suicide, not out of cowardice but from a fundamental assertion of her own humanity and worth. Their encounter in that village square represents a moment of recognition. Two people from opposite sides of a brutal war, seeing each other as human beings rather than enemies. In that moment, Jim's choice to intervene and Yuki's choice to survive become acts of resistance against the dehumanizing logic of war itself. The sign that hung around Yuki's neck, Traitor, written in bold Japanese characters, represents the ultimate weapon of authoritarian control, the power to define loyalty and betrayal, to determine who belongs and who is expendable. Both Jim and Yuki are called traitors by their respective societies, Jim for serving America despite his Japanese ancestry, Yuki for choosing survival over suicide. Yet their betrayals are actually affirmations of a higher loyalty. Loyalty to human dignity, to justice, to life itself. This is the paradox at the heart of their story. True loyalty sometimes requires betraying false loyalties. True courage sometimes means refusing to be brave in the ways that power demands. True honor sometimes means surviving when you're told that death is the only honorable choice. The legacy of the MIS and the Himayuri survivors continues to resonate today. In an era of rising nationalism, ethnic tensions, and dehumanizing rhetoric about the other, their stories remind us that bridges between cultures are built by individuals willing to stand in the space between, to translate not just words, but values, to insist on seeing humanity in those designated as enemies. Jim Takahashi's 5 minutes in that village square, the time Lieutenant Morrison gave him to sort this out, changed one life directly, and perhaps many more indirectly. The villagers who witnessed his intervention saw an alternative to the Kempei's terror, a demonstration that authority could be used for protection rather than persecution. Some of them, like the elderly woman who spoke up, found the courage to resist the mob mentality. Others carried the memory of that moment forward, a seed of doubt about the propaganda they had been fed. For Yuki, those 5 minutes meant the difference between death and a future. She survived the war, and though her path afterward was difficult, she lived. She had the chance to build a life, to find meaning in survival, to perhaps share her story so that others might understand the true cost of war. In choosing life, she honored the memory of the Himayuri nurses who died, not by joining them in death but by living fully and working for peace. The empty post in Mabuni village, the rope lying in the dust, the trampled sign, these images capture the fragility and power of moral intervention. The machinery of violence and hatred can be stopped, but only by individuals willing to step forward, to risk themselves, to insist that there is a better way. Jim Takahashi was one of thousands who made that choice, but each individual choice mattered. Each life saved was a universe preserved. In the end, the story asks us to consider what we would do in similar circumstances. When faced with injustice, do we look away or intervene? When told to hate, do we comply or resist? When given the choice between easy cruelty and difficult compassion, which do we choose? These are not abstract questions. They confront us in different forms throughout our lives, in how we treat those who are different, in how we respond to fear and propaganda, in whether we stand up for others at cost to ourselves. The Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945, after 82 days of brutal combat. The Japanese military lost over 100,000 soldiers. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including 12,000 dead. And caught between these two massive armies, Okinawan civilians died in staggering numbers, their suffering a testament to war's indiscriminate cruelty. But within that vast tragedy, there were moments of grace, interpreters who saved lives, soldiers who showed mercy, civilians who chose compassion over vengeance. These moments didn't change the outcome of the war, but they changed individual fates. They proved that even in humanity's darkest hours, human decency persists. They demonstrated that we always have choices, even when those choices are constrained and dangerous. Sergeant James Takahashi and Yuki Nakamura never saw each other again after that day in May 1945. Jim continued his work with the MIS through the end of the war, saving more lives, building more bridges. Yuki recovered in the Ishikawa civilian camp, eventually building a new life from the ruins of the old. Their paths diverged, but they carried the memory of their encounter, a moment when one person's courage gave another person a future. That is the legacy worth remembering. Not just the grand strategies and decisive battles, but the individual moments when people chose humanity over hatred, life over death, courage over fear. These choices don't make headlines or change the course of history in obvious ways, but they change everything for the people involved, and they remind us that we are not helpless before the forces of violence and injustice. We can resist. We can intervene. We can insist on seeing the humanity in others, even when, especially when, we are told they are enemies. The sign said traitor, but the real betrayal would have been to walk away, to let fear and hatred have their way, to accept that some lives don't matter. Jim Takahashi refused that betrayal. He cut the ropes, lifted the burden, and gave Yuki Nakamura back her life. In doing so, he affirmed the highest loyalty of all, loyalty to the belief that every human life has value, that justice matters more than obedience, and that we are all responsible for each other. That is what he did next, and that is what we are all called to do when we encounter our own moments of choice, to stand in the gap, to speak for the voiceless, to insist that there is a better way. The war may be over, but the choice remains. What will we do when we see the sign that says traitor and the person who needs someone to cut the ropes? Will we walk away, or will we step forward? The answer to that question defines not just individual character, but the kind of world we build together. Jim Takahashi and Yuki Nakamura, in their brief encounter amid the ruins of war, showed us what is possible when we choose courage over fear, compassion over cruelty, and life over death. Their story, and the stories of thousands like them, remind us that we are not powerless. We can make a difference, one life at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of moral courage at a time. That is the lesson of Okinawa, May 28, 1945. That is the legacy of the MIS and the Himayuri survivors. That is the challenge and the hope they leave us. The question is not what they did. The question is what we will do when our moment comes. If this story moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We bring you powerful untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. If you're already part of our community, hit that like button to help this story reach more people who need to hear it. And we'd love to know your thoughts. What would you have done in Sergeant Takahashi's place? Would you have had the courage to intervene? Leave a comment below and join the conversation. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these important historical narratives. Thank you for watching, and remember, history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we choose to do with the lessons it teaches us.